Close your eyes now and let us drift back through the mists of time. Back more than 2,000 years to a moment when the world was about to change forever. Not through conquest, not through war, but through a journey. A single journey that would open pathways across continents and connect civilizations that had never known of each other's existence. It is the year 138 before the Common Era. In the imperial palace of the Han Dynasty, preparations are being made. But these are not preparations for trade caravans or merchants seeking fortune. No, the emperor seeks something far more urgent. He seeks allies. For beyond the northern borders, a fierce confederation of nomadic tribes, known as the Xiongnu, pose a constant threat to the empire's peace. Ancient China, in these early days, was not looking outward with dreams of silk and spices exchanging hands across desert sands. The Han Dynasty sought survival, security, and strategic partnerships against a formidable enemy. And so a man is chosen. His name is Zhang Qian, an imperial envoy, trusted and brave. He is given a mission that would test the limits of human endurance and courage. Zhang Qian is sent west, into lands unknown, into territories the Han court knows only through whispers and rumors. His task seems simple in concept, but daunting in execution. Find allies among the peoples beyond the western frontiers. Find those who might stand with China against the Xiongnu threat. The year is 138 BCE when Zhang Qian departs, and he will not return for over a decade. Let that settle into your mind as you drift. 12 long years in foreign lands, facing perils we can scarcely imagine. 12 years of discovery. Now, rest easy as we follow his path, not with urgency, but with the gentle patience of centuries. Zhang Qian's journeys would take him far beyond what anyone in the Han court had imagined. Through mountain passes, where eagles soared above snow-capped peaks, across valleys where unfamiliar languages filled the air like music, past cities built of sun-baked brick, where trade and culture already flourished in ways that would astonish his reports. As he traveled, meeting peoples and kingdoms, a revelation slowly unfolded before him, like a scroll being carefully opened. There were powerful civilizations beyond China. Not merely tribes or scattered settlements, but sophisticated societies with their own grand histories, their own arts and sciences, their own riches and wisdom. The Dunhuang people in the Fergana Valley, famed for their celestial horses. The Sogdians, master merchants who would later become the Silk Road's most essential traders. The Bactrians, heirs to Greek influence left by Alexander's eastern campaigns. Kingdom after kingdom, culture after culture, each revelation more wondrous than the last. Zhang Qian observed how goods moved between these distant places. He saw Indian cottons in Central Asian markets. He noticed Roman glassware glinting in the sun, far from its Mediterranean origins. He understood, perhaps for the first time in Chinese history, that there existed a world of interconnected peoples, all hungry for connection, for exchange, for the treasures that lay beyond their own horizons. When Zhang Qian finally returned to the Han court, somewhere between 126 and 125 BCE, he brought back more than just diplomatic reports. He brought back knowledge, maps, not of parchment, but of memory, stories of distant lands, and most importantly, he brought back possibility. History would come to know Zhang Qian as the father of the Silk Road, not because he built roads or established trade posts, but because he opened eyes. He opened minds. He transformed the unknown into the imaginable, and in doing so, He planted seeds that would grow into roots spanning continents. These roots truly began to form and flourish during the Han Dynasty, those centuries stretching from 206 before the Common Era to 220 of the Common Era. 4 centuries of gradual connection, of paths worn deeper by countless footsteps, of relationships built between peoples separated by deserts and mountains. The Han period became the cradle of this great exchange, though those walking these paths had no grand name for what they were creating. And here is something that might surprise you as you settle deeper into rest. The term Silk Road did not exist in ancient times. The merchants who traveled these routes, the caravans that braved sandstorms and bandits, the families who settled in oasis towns along the way, none of them called it the Silk Road. They simply traveled. They simply traded. They simply lived their lives along routes that connected their world. The name Silk Road would not be spoken for nearly 2,000 years. It was coined much later, in the year 1877, by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen. He looked back across the centuries and gave a name to something that had been nameless, weaving together countless individual journeys into a single romantic notion, the Silk Road, a name that evokes both the luxury of Chinese silk and the dusty romance of ancient travel. But even this name, as beautiful as it sounds, tells us only part of the truth. Let this final thought carry you gently towards sleep. It was never a single road, never one path stretching from east to west like a ribbon laid across a map. No, it was a network of routes, branching and connecting like the veins in a leaf, like rivers finding their way to the sea. There were northern routes that skirted the Taklamakan Desert, passing through oasis cities like Turpan and Kashgar. There were southern routes that took different paths around that same merciless desert. There were mountain routes through the soaring Pamirs, so high that travelers struggled to breathe. There were sea routes too, connecting ports and islands, carrying goods and ideas across waves instead of sands. Each route had its own character, its own dangers, its own rewards. Some merchants might travel only one small section in their entire lifetime, passing goods from one set of hands to another. Each trader, a link in an impossibly long chain connecting the Mediterranean to the Pacific. A piece of silk might change hands a dozen times, traveling for years, before reaching its final destination. And so the Silk Road was never truly a road at all, but rather a conversation, a long, slow conversation between civilizations, carried on the backs of camels and in the holds of ships, whispered in 100 languages under 1,000 stars. Rest now, knowing that you've taken the first steps on this ancient journey. Zhang Qian's footsteps echo across the centuries, inviting us to follow, to discover, to dream of the paths that connected our world long before we thought connection was possible. Let the gentle hum of history carry you softly into sleep. Breathe deeply now, and let your mind expand. Expand like the horizon, stretching endlessly before a traveler standing at the edge of the known world. Imagine for a moment the sheer vastness of what we speak of. The network of routes we now call the Silk Road stretched over 4,000 miles. 4,000 miles. Let that distance settle into your consciousness like sand settling after a wind has passed. To travel from one end to these routes to the other was to cross nearly a quarter of the Earth's circumference. It was to journey from the imperial courts of China, with their red lacquered pillars and silk banners, all the way to the sun-drenched shores of the Mediterranean, where Roman columns gleamed white against the azure sea. The routes ran from China to the Mediterranean, connecting two worlds that had existed for centuries in complete ignorance of one another. But this was no leisurely path, no comfortable highway paved with good intentions and easy passage. The travelers who braved these routes faced challenges that would break the spirit of lesser souls. They faced deserts that could swallow entire caravans without a trace. They faced mountains so high that the air itself seemed thin and reluctant to fill the lungs. They faced endless steppes where the grass whispered secrets in languages older than empires, and where the horizon played tricks on weary eyes. Let us speak now of the Great Divide, the Taklamakan Desert. Even its name carries a warning in the languages of those who live near its edges. Some say it means go in and you won't come out. Others translate it as place of no return. This deadly expanse of sand and stone divided the road like a chasm divides a path along a cliff edge. One could not simply cross directly through its heart, not if one wished to survive. And so, like water finding its way around an insurmountable obstacle, the routes split. The deadly Taklamakan Desert divided the road into two main arteries, and northern and southern routes formed around it, like arms reaching around to embrace what could not be confronted directly. Picture the northern route now, as you sink deeper into comfort and rest. This path passed through some of the most storied cities in human history. Samarkand, jewel of Central Asia, where blue-tiled domes caught the light like captured pieces of sky. The northern route wound along the feet of the Tian Shan, the Celestial Mountains, so named because their snow-covered peaks seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. Here, travelers could replenish their supplies in oasis towns, each one a miracle of life in the midst of harshness. Each one a testament to human perseverance and ingenuity. The caravans along the northern route would pass through territories where different peoples mingled and traded. They would hear the Sogdian language in the marketplaces, that lingua franca of ancient commerce. They would see Buddhist monasteries carved into cliffsides, and later, as centuries passed, they would see minarets rising toward the sky. This northern path was longer in some ways, but it offered more opportunities for trade, more places to rest, more chances to hear news from both east and west. Now let your mind's eye drift southward to the other path around that great desert. The southern route passed through places whose names still echo with mystery and ancient beauty. Dunhuang, guardian city at the edge of Chinese civilization, where cave temples held treasures of art and scripture, where merchants and monks would pause before venturing into the uncertain territories beyond. And further west, Khotan, renowned for its jade and its secrets. For it was in Khotan, legend says, that the techniques of silk production first escaped from China, smuggled out by a princess who hid silkworm eggs in her elaborate headdress. The southern route hugged closer to the Kunlun Mountains, following a string of oases like pearls on a thread. Each oasis town was a world unto itself, a place where cultures mingled and languages blended, where a merchant from Persia might share tea with a Buddhist monk from Kashmir, where stories from a dozen lands were traded as freely as the goods themselves. Both routes, northern and southern, eventually converged again in the west, like two streams flowing back into a single river. and where they met, something extraordinary rose from the earth itself. The Pamir Mountains became a central crossroads of the ancient world. Here, at elevations so high that even the eagles seemed to struggle, trade routes from every direction intersected. Paths from China met paths from India. Routes from the steppes met routes from Persia. The Pamirs were not merely an obstacle to be crossed, but a meeting place, a junction where the world came together. These mountains earned a name that speaks to their majesty, the roof of the world, and truly, standing in those high places, with nothing but sky above, and the world spread below like a vast map. One might believe that name to be literal truth. The air was thin, the cold was biting, but the sense of standing at the center of everything, that must have been intoxicating. But not all trade flowed through mountain passes and desert oases. Let your thoughts drift northward now, across the endless grasslands. The steppe route served nomadic traders, those peoples for whom movement was life itself. The Scythians, the Xiongnu, later the Mongols. These were peoples born to the saddle, for whom distance was measured not in discomfort, but in freedom. The steppe route carried furs and horses, amber and honey, moving goods between the settled civilizations to the south and the vast forests to the north. It was faster than the desert routes in some seasons, but required different skills, different knowledge, different kinds of courage. And there were other passes, other crossroads, each one a story unto itself. The Karakoram Pass linked China to South Asia, a treacherous path through some of the highest mountains on Earth, yet vital for trade between the two great civilizations. Himalayan passes enabled Tibet-India trade, carrying goods and ideas across barriers that seemed designed by nature to keep peoples apart, yet could not prevent the human hunger for connection. Some of these passes were open only during brief summer months, when the snow retreated just enough to allow passage. Merchants would wait, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, or for the moment when the route became passable. And then they would rush through, racing against the turning of the seasons, knowing that to be caught by early winter snows meant almost certain death. As the routes flowed westward, they reached their termini in the great cities of the Mediterranean world. Western termini included Antioch, Damascus, and Alexandria. Each name resonates with history, with power, with the cosmopolitan mixing of peoples that made these cities the New Yorks and Londons of their age. In Antioch, one might find silk fresh from China being examined by Roman merchants. In Damascus, Persian and Indian goods changed hands beneath ancient archways. In Alexandria, scholars and traders alike gathered in the shadow of the great lighthouse, that beacon guiding ships to harbor, just as the Silk Road itself guided cultures toward one another. But the story does not end with camel caravans and mountain passes. As centuries passed, as human ambition and ingenuity found new expressions, the routes expanded in ways that would have astonished Zhang Qian. Maritime silk routes later connected China to Africa, weaving the Indian Ocean into the great tapestry of exchange. Chinese junks with their distinctive sails ventured south and west, island hopping through Southeast Asia, crossing to India, rounding the Arabian Peninsula, reaching the shores of East Africa. These sea routes brought new goods into the network: rhinoceros horn and ivory from Africa, pearls from the Persian Gulf, spices from the islands of Southeast Asia, those precious seasonings that would, centuries later, motivate European explorers to circumnavigate the globe. The maritime routes also carried something perhaps more valuable than any commodity. They carried people, monks and missionaries, diplomats and adventurers, each one a carrier of ideas, each one a bridge between worldviews. And here is something remarkable to contemplate as you drift towards sleep. Sea routes eventually surpassed land routes in importance and volume. The ocean, once a barrier, became a highway. Ships could carry more than camels, travel faster when winds were favorable, and face different dangers. Storms and pirates rather than sandstorms and bandits, but often more manageable ones. By the medieval period, more goods flowed across the Indian Ocean than across the deserts of Central Asia. So you see, the Silk Road was never static, never a single path frozen in time. It was always growing, changing, adapting. It flowed around obstacles like water, finding new channels when old ones closed. It reached higher into mountains and deeper into seas. It connected not just 2 points, but countless points, creating a web of human connection that spanned deserts and oceans, mountains and steppes. 4,000 miles of possibility, 4,000 miles of courage, 4,000 miles of human beings refusing to let distance or difficulty prevent them from reaching toward one another. Rest now in the knowledge of how vast the world is, and how determined humanity has always been to cross it, to connect across it, to find each other across impossible distances. Let the roots carry you gently into dreams. Now, let us turn our attention to the heart of the matter, to the reason these roots existed at all. Not the grand empires or the diplomatic missions, but something simpler, more human, more tangible. The goods themselves. The treasures that moved across those 4,000 miles, changing hands in dusty caravanserais, crossing borders that existed only in the minds of rulers, traveling from craftsman to merchant to buyer, in a chain that could span years and continents. Picture a bolt of silk, smooth as water, shimmering in the lamplight of a merchant's tent. This is where our story truly lives. In the things that people desired, the objects they would cross deserts to obtain, the materials they would pay fortunes to possess. From China westward, a river of wonders flowed. And the greatest of these wonders, the one that would give its name to the entire network of routes, was silk itself. In ancient China, silk was far more than mere fabric. Silk served as currency, diplomacy, and status, all woven together in those delicate threads. Imagine a world where you might pay your taxes in bolts of silk, where an emperor might secure peace with a neighboring kingdom by sending them silk as tribute, where the quality and quantity of silk you wore announced your place in society as clearly as a title or a crown. The techniques of silk production were among China's most closely guarded secrets. The process began with tiny silkworm eggs, no larger than poppy seeds. These would hatch into caterpillars that fed voraciously on mulberry leaves, growing fat and ready. Then each worm would spin its cocoon, extruding a single thread that could stretch for nearly a mile. Patient hands would carefully unwind these threads, so fine that several must be twisted together to create a strand strong enough to weave. The result was a fabric that seemed to capture light itself, that draped and flowed like no other textile known to the ancient world. And in Rome, at the western terminus of these great routes, silk was worth its weight in gold, literally. Roman historians complained about the fortune flowing eastward to pay for this precious material. Senators worried that wearing silk was unmanly, effeminate, scandalous. And yet, the demand never ceased. Roman matrons and nobles draped themselves in Chinese silk despite the cost, despite the moralizing, because nothing else possessed that particular luxury, that specific statement of wealth and taste. But silk, though the most famous, was far from the only treasure China sent westward. Porcelain was prized across Eurasia, those impossibly delicate vessels that seemed too fine to be made of mere clay. The Chinese had mastered the art of creating pure white ceramics that rang like bells when struck, so thin that light could pass through them, yet surprisingly strong. To peoples who knew only rough earthenware, Chinese porcelain must have seemed like magic made solid. Lacquerware exports travelled westward too. Boxes and screens covered in layer upon layer of lacquer, each coat polished to a mirror shine, often inlaid with mother of pearl that caught the light like trapped moonbeams. These pieces could take months or even years to complete, each layer requiring time to dry and harden before the next could be applied. Jade from cotton made its way to Chinese workshops, where master carvers would transform the cold stone into objects of beauty and spiritual significance. Jade was more than decoration in Chinese culture. It represented virtue, immortality, the connection between heaven and earth. The finest jade came from the rivers and mountains around Khotan, those stones shaped by millennia of water and weather before human hands ever touched them. Bronze mirrors travelled westward, their polished surfaces reflecting faces in cities from Chang'an to Samarkand. These were not like modern mirrors. They required constant polishing to maintain their reflectivity, and they often bore intricate decorations on their reverse sides, designs of dragons and phoenixes, poetry and wisdom cast in metal. And then there was paper. Paper technology begins its westward journey along these routes, though it travelled slower than silk, less dramatically than porcelain. The Chinese had discovered how to transform plant fibers, mulberry, bark, hemp, even old fishing nets, into smooth sheets suitable for writing and painting. This knowledge would eventually revolutionize the West, but it moved gradually, carefully, almost secretly, from workshop to workshop across the centuries. Let us not forget the fragrances and flavors. Spices like ginger and cinnamon traveled from China and Southeast Asia. Those potent additions that could transform a simple meal into something memorable, that could preserve food through long winters, that could mask the taste of meat that had begun to turn. In an age before refrigeration, spices were not luxury, but necessity, and they commanded prices that reflected their importance. But the Silk Road was never a one-way journey. The flow moved both directions, and from the west eastward came treasures equally precious, equally desired. Among the most celebrated were Fagana's heavenly horses. These magnificent animals became legendary in Chinese courts. They were larger than native Chinese horses, more powerful, better suited for warfare. Chinese texts describe them as sweating blood, likely caused by a parasite, but interpreted as a sign of their supernatural nature. Emperors would pay enormous sums for these horses, mount military expeditions to secure them. A good Fergana horse could change the fortune of a cavalry unit, could mean the difference between victory and defeat in battle. Roman and Persian glassware flowed eastward, objects of wonder in lands where glass-making techniques were less advanced or unknown. These were not simple glass vessels, but artworks. blown glass in colors that seemed impossible, cut glass that caught light like gemstones, cameo glass, where different colored layers were carved to create images of startling depth and beauty. To hold a Roman glass vessel was to hold captured light, frozen water, solidified air. The Chinese called glass water essence, or fire pearls, trying to find words for something that seemed to exist between states of matter. Gold and silver coins traveled the routes, not just as payment, but as models. Chinese craftsmen studied foreign coinage, learning new techniques of metallurgy, new artistic styles, new ways of representing power and authority in miniature. Each coin was a small ambassador, carrying the image of a distant ruler into foreign lands. Woolen carpets came from Persian workshops, their intricate patterns telling stories, the deep pile providing warmth and comfort. These carpets could take years to complete, with knot upon tiny knot, creating images of gardens and geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move as you walked past them. In China, where silk carpets existed, these woolen versions were prized for their different texture, their foreign aesthetic, their connection to distant lands. Precious stones made the journey eastward. Lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone prized by Egyptians and Mesopotamians for millennia, its color like night sky captured in rock. Turquoise from Persian mines, its blue-green hue believed to bring protection and good fortune. Gemstones of every type, rubies like drops of blood, emeralds like concentrated spring, sapphires like pieces of heaven. Ivory and incense arrived from even further south and west. Ivory from African elephants, incense from Arabian frankincense trees. These luxury items served religious and ceremonial purposes. Ivory could be carved into intricate sculptures, into combs and ornaments, into Buddhist statues that gleamed white in temple halls. Incense. The scent of frankincense, or myrrh rising in smoke, carrying prayers upward, purifying spaces, marking moments of significance. These scents traveled thousands of miles to fill temples and palaces throughout East Asia. But perhaps most transformative were the simple agricultural gifts that flowed eastward. Grapes and winemaking techniques came to China from the west. Imagine the wonder of Chinese farmers seeing these vines for the first time, learning to cultivate them, discovering the alchemy of fermentation that could transform fruit into something entirely new. Wine became associated with foreign sophistication, with the exotic West, and Chinese poets would later celebrate wine in verses that still resonate today. Nuts traveled eastward too, and with them, new flavors, new possibilities. Walnuts, almonds, pistachios, each one a small package of nutrition and taste, each one suited to different climates and cuisines. These nuts would become naturalized along the routes, grown in oases and river valleys, until it became hard to remember that they had once been foreign, exotic, new. And sugar. Sugar and its refining methods. The ability to extract sweet crystals from sugarcane, to create something that could sweeten without honey, without fruit, without fermentation. This knowledge traveled slowly, carefully, because those who possessed it understood its value. Sugar would become a commodity worth fighting wars over. But in these early days, it was simply another wonder moving along the routes, another piece of knowledge exchanged between civilizations. You see, the Silk Road was never just about silk. It was about everything humans could create, everything we could grow, everything we could imagine and desire. It was a great exchange, a conversation in objects, where each civilization said, "Look what we have made," and received in return, "Look what we have dreamed." Each item carried more than its physical form. Each carried techniques and knowledge, aesthetics and ideas. A glass vessel taught new ways of thinking about transparency. A walnut taught new possibilities for cultivation. A bronze mirror reflected not just faces but entire worldviews. Rest now, surrounded by these imagined treasures. Let your mind drift through caravanserais filled with wonders, through market stalls displaying the world's riches, through the hands of countless merchants who touched these objects and sent them onwards. Always onwards, connecting us all through the simple human desire for beautiful things, useful things, surprising things. The dance of exchange continues in your dreams. Close your eyes and breathe deeply now, for we turn from the tangible to something more ethereal, more profound. The Silk Road carried silk and spices, yes, but it carried something far more precious, far more transformative. It carried ideas. It carried beliefs. It carried the contents of human minds and hearts across those vast distances. And in doing so, it changed the world in ways that no amount of gold or porcelain ever could. Let us begin with a journey within a journey, a sacred quest that would become legend. Buddhism spreads from India to East Asia, along these very routes we have been following. Born in the foothills of the Himalayas, in the teachings of a prince who became an enlightened one, Buddhism traveled northward and eastward, like water finding new channels. Monks walked the routes, their bare feet touching the same stones as merchant caravans. They carried no silk, no precious metals, but they carried sutras, sacred texts rolled and wrapped with infinite care, each word a seed that might take root in foreign soil. And among these traveling monks, one stands apart in memory and legend. Xuanzang's sacred journey in the 7th century would become one of the most celebrated pilgrimages in human history. This Chinese monk, dissatisfied with the incomplete Buddhist texts available in China, decided to travel to India itself, to the source, to bring back authentic scriptures and true understanding. His journey took 17 years. 17 years of walking, riding, climbing, crossing. He traveled without imperial permission, leaving Chang'an in secret. He crossed the Gobi Desert, where he nearly died of thirst, where he wandered lost among the dunes. He climbed mountain passes where the cold bit through his robes. He was robbed by bandits and honored by kings. He studied at the great Buddhist University of Nalanda in India, debating with the finest scholars of his age. And when Xuanzang finally returned to China, he brought with him hundreds of sacred texts, statues, and relics. But more than that, he brought vivid descriptions of all he had seen, accounts that would inspire Chinese imagination for centuries. His travels were later fictionalized in the beloved novel Journey to the West, where his adventures became populated with magical creatures and divine interventions. But the true journey needed no embellishment. It was already a testament to the power of faith and determination. Along the routes Xuanzang traveled, Buddhist cave temples emerge, carved into cliffsides, excavated from living rock. Imagine standing before these caves, at Dunhuang, at Yungang, at Longmen, where devotion took the form of chisels striking stone. Inside, walls covered with paintings, thousands of Buddha figures, bodhisattvas with serene expressions, celestial beings dancing in eternal joy. These caves became libraries, monasteries, rest stops for weary pilgrims. They preserved not just religious art, but entire worldviews, frozen in pigment and stone. But Buddhism was not the only faith to travel these routes. Let your mind expand now to embrace the remarkable religious diversity that flowed along the Silk Road. This was a corridor of tolerance, where different beliefs could coexist, where merchants of one faith might fund temples of another, where the sacred texts of multiple religions might rest on the same library shelf. Nestorian Christianity reaches China, carried by missionaries from the Middle East who believed that Christ had two distinct natures, human and divine, a view rejected by the mainstream church but embraced along these eastern routes. In the 8th century, in the Chinese capital of Chang'an, these Nestorian Christians erected a monument that still exists today. The Xi'an stele records its presence, a 10-foot-tall limestone pillar covered with Chinese characters and Syriac script, detailing the arrival of Christianity in China, listing the names of monks and converts, standing as silent witness to a chapter of history that would have been forgotten without its testimony. Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism travel east as well, those Persian faiths with their cosmic battles between light and darkness, their fire temples and their dualist cosmologies. In Central Asian cities, fire altars burned continuously, tended by priests who had traveled from Persia. Manichaean texts, with their beautiful illuminations, circulated in Chinese translations. For a time, these foreign religions flourished in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of Tang Dynasty China, where the exotic and foreign was celebrated rather than feared. And then, beginning in the 7th century, Islam spreads through trade and conquest, moving along the Silk Road like dawn moving across the landscape. Muslim merchants, valued for their honesty and their commercial networks, established communities in Chinese port cities. Muslim armies pushed into Central Asia, converting or conquering. Gradually, the Buddhist and Zoroastrian cities of the Silk Road became Muslim. Minarets replaced pagodas. The call to prayer echoed where temple bells once rang. It was not always peaceful, this transformation, but it was profound, and it reshaped the Silk Road's cultural landscape forever. And now, let us speak of knowledge of a different kind. Technical knowledge, the practical wisdom that changes how societies function, how armies fight, how scholars calculate and navigate. Papermaking reaches Samarkand in the 8th century, according to legend, when Chinese papermakers were captured after a battle and forced to reveal their secrets. Whether the story is precisely true matters less than its symbolism. Knowledge, once released, cannot be recaptured. From Samarkand, paper spreads to the Islamic world and Europe, gradually replacing expensive parchment and fragile papyrus. Imagine how this changed everything. More books could be produced, more people could learn to read, ideas could spread faster, wider, deeper. Paper was democracy made from pulp and water. Printing techniques travel west as well, though more slowly. Woodblock printing, then movable type. The ability to reproduce texts quickly and accurately, to make many copies where before there had been only one. This knowledge would eventually spark revolutions in Europe, but it began in China, developed in China, and traveled westward along these routes like so many other innovations. And gunpowder. Gunpowder alters global warfare. First used in China for fireworks, for entertainment and celebration, it became something darker when someone realized its military potential. Recipes for gunpowder, instructions for making weapons with it, moved westward. Within centuries, The crack of firearms would echo across battlefields from Japan to England, and the course of history would be forever changed by a Chinese discovery meant initially to delight rather than destroy. The magnetic compass spreads along the route, that simple yet miraculous device. A magnetized needle floating in water or oil, always swinging to point north, allowing navigation even when clouds obscured the stars. Chinese navigators had used compasses for centuries. Now the knowledge spread to Arab sailors, to European explorers, enabling voyages that would eventually circumnavigate the globe. Mathematics and zero move westward, that elegant concept originating in India. The idea that nothing could be something, that zero was a number in its own right, not merely an absence. This mathematical revolution traveled with Indian scholars and texts, reaching the Islamic world where it was refined and expanded, eventually reaching Europe where it would enable the scientific revolution. All of this began with ideas traveling along the Silk Road. Astronomy and star charts exchanged hands in observatories from Baghdad to Beijing. Scholars compared their observations, their theories, their instruments. They realized that the same stars shone over all humanity, that the heavens were common ground, even when earthly kingdoms warred with one another. Medical knowledge shared between civilizations saved countless lives. Chinese acupuncture techniques, Indian Ayurvedic medicine, Greek humoral theory. Physicians along the Silk Road learned from each other, adopting what worked, debating what didn't, slowly advancing the understanding of the human body and its ailments. Architectural styles blend in the cities along the route, creating buildings that belong to no single tradition, but synthesized many. A Buddhist temple with a Persian dome, a mosque incorporating Chinese architectural elements, caravanserais that featured design elements from a dozen different cultures, pragmatic and beautiful, all at once. Musical instruments, cross continents, each one carrying its own scales, its own techniques, its own emotional vocabulary. The pipa, a pear-shaped lute, traveled from Persia to China. The erhu, the Chinese fiddle, may have had Central Asian ancestors. In courts and marketplaces, music became a universal language, telling stories without words, conveying emotions that transcended cultural boundaries. Dance and theatre traditions spread along with the merchants and monks. Movements and gestures, costume styles and makeup techniques, narrative structures and dramatic conventions. All of these traveled and transformed, creating new hybrid forms. A dancer in Chang'an might incorporate movements learned from visiting Central Asian performers. An actor in Samarkand might adopt storytelling techniques from Chinese opera. Chess evolves and travels from India westward, changing rules and pieces as it moves. The war game that began as chaturanga becomes shatranj in Persia, then chess in Europe, each culture adapting it to reflect their own military realities, their own strategic thinking. Yet the essential challenge remains: to outthink your opponent, to plan many moves ahead, to accept that victory requires sacrifice. Stirrups revolutionize cavalry, those simple loops of metal or leather that allow riders to stand in the saddle, to fight more effectively from horseback, to ride longer distances with less fatigue. This innovation, developed somewhere in Central Asia or China, spread to transform warfare across Eurasia. Knights in medieval Europe owed their effectiveness in part to stirrups that traveled the Silk Road centuries before. Windmill technology spreads from Persia eastward and westward, harnessing the invisible power of moving air to grind grain, to pump water, to do the work that would otherwise require human or animal muscle. The Persian vertical windmills were different from the horizontal windmills that would later appear in Europe, but the principle was the same: use nature's free energy to improve human life. Astrolabes are refined through the collaboration of scholars across cultures. These intricate instruments, capable of measuring the positions of stars and planets, of calculating time, of solving complex astronomical problems, became more sophisticated as they passed through Greek, Islamic, and European hands. Each culture added refinements, improvements, new applications. You see, the Silk Road was humanity's first great conversation, a dialogue conducted not just in words but in techniques, in beliefs, in the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Every innovation shared was a gift to the future. Every religious text translated was a bridge between hearts. Every musical instrument learned was a new way of expressing what it means to be human. Rest now in the knowledge that we are all inheritors of this great exchange. The ideas that flowed along these routes live on in us, in the technologies we use, in the beliefs we hold, in the ways we understand the world. Let the rivers of wisdom carry you gently into sleep, knowing that the conversation continues still, that we are still exchanging, still learning, still building bridges across the distances that separate us. Settle now into stillness, and let us walk together through places that once blazed with life, cities that were the beating hearts of the Silk Road. These were not mere stops along a route. They were destinations in themselves, each one a world complete, each one a story written in stone and silk, in prayer and prophet, in the daily rhythms of thousands of lives intersecting. Picture a city rising from the morning mist, its walls catching the first light of dawn. Hear the murmur of awakening, market vendors arranging their goods, the clop of hooves on paving stones, the call to prayer, the chanting from a temple, voices in a dozen languages greeting the day. These cities were miracles of human ambition, oases of civilization in landscapes that could be harsh and unforgiving. Let us begin in the east, where the great routes originated. Chang'an as the eastern gateway. Breathe in the scale of it. During the Tang Dynasty, Chang'an was quite possibly the largest city in the world, home to perhaps 1 million souls. Imagine walls that stretched for miles, gates that stood as tall as houses, avenues so wide that they could accommodate 9 carriages riding side by side. This was the capital of the Middle Kingdom, the seat of emperors, the place where the Silk Road truly began. In Chang'an, you could walk through markets where merchants from every corner of the known world displayed their wares. Persian rugs spread on the ground, Indian spices piled in fragrant pyramids, Central Asian horses tethered in rows. The city was cosmopolitan in a way that wouldn't be matched for centuries. Foreign religions were tolerated, even celebrated. Zoroastrian temples stood near Buddhist monasteries. Nestorian churches welcomed worshippers. The city hummed with languages: Chinese, Persian, Sogdian, Sanskrit, Arabic, Turkish. The Western market in Chang'an was legendary. Here, a merchant just arrived from months of travel could sell his goods. Here, officials inspected caravans and collected taxes. Here, stories were exchanged as freely as coins. Tales of distant kingdoms, rumors of wars, news of technological innovations, gossip about foreign customs. The Western market was where the Silk Road became real, tangible, alive. From Chang'an, caravans departed westward, and their first great milestone was Dunhuang and the Mogao Caves. Dunhuang sat at the edge of Chinese civilization, the last major city before the desert swallowed the world. It was a place of preparation, where merchants stocked up on supplies, hired guides, said prayers for safe passage. But Dunhuang's true glory lies in those caves carved into the cliff face just outside the city. The Mogao Caves, nearly 500 of them, excavated over 1,000 years, their interiors transformed into sacred spaces. Let your mind enter one of these caves now. Your eyes adjust to the dim light. Slowly, images emerge, walls covered entirely in paintings, ceiling adorned with celestial beings, a massive Buddha statue gazing serenely into eternity. These caves were libraries, temples, and artwork all at once. Pilgrims on their way to India or returning to China would stop here, would add their own contributions, would pray for protection. In one sealed cave, closed for centuries, archaeologists found a treasure trove, 50,000 manuscripts and paintings, preserved by the dry desert air, a snapshot of Silk Road culture frozen in time. Westward still, caravans would reach Turpan's fertile depression, a geographical wonder, a place that sits below sea level, one of the lowest and hottest places in Central Asia, yet blessed with water from underground channels called khares. These ingenious irrigation systems, tunneled through the earth, brought snowmelt from distant mountains to this depression, creating gardens in the desert. Turpan became wealthy despite its harsh climate. Perhaps because of it, the extreme heat made grapes exceptionally sweet. Turpan's raisins were famous across Asia. The city was a crossroads where Uyghur culture flourished, where Buddhist and later Islamic traditions mingled, where the summer heat was so intense that much of life moved underground into cool basement rooms. Further west lay Khotan and its jade trade, that city we have mentioned before. Khotan sat on the southern route, fed by rivers descending from the Kunlun Mountains, rivers that carried jade, that cold, smooth stone so prized in Chinese culture. The workshops of Khotan transformed rough jade into objects of beauty, carved ornaments, ritual vessels, jewelry that would eventually grace the bodies of Chinese nobility. But Khotan was more than jade. It was a Buddhist center, home to monasteries and scholars. It was a multicultural city where Indian, Chinese, and Central Asian influences blended into something unique. And according to legend, it was in Khotan that silk production escaped from China, smuggled by that clever princess who hid eggs and mulberry seeds in her elaborate headdress. Now, let your imagination travel to Kashgar, where routes converged from every direction. Routes from China met routes from India. Paths from the north joined paths from the south. Kashgar was a junction, a crossroads, a place of perpetual motion and mixing. In Kashgar's bazaars, you could find anything. A merchant from Russia might stand beside one from Tibet. A scholar from Baghdad might debate with one from Beijing. The Sunday market in Kashgar, which still exists today, echoing its ancient glory, was famous across Asia. Thousands would gather to trade everything from camels to carpets, from spices to stories. And then, perhaps the most luminous jewel of all, Samarkand's golden age. Samarkand. Even the name sounds like poetry. This city in the heart of Central Asia became, at various points in history, a center of culture and learning that rivaled any city on earth. Samarkand was built for beauty. Its architecture spoke of confidence and wealth. Massive mosques with turquoise domes, madrasas with intricate tilework, observatories where astronomers mapped the heavens. The Registan, Samarkand's central square, featured buildings so magnificent that travelers would weep at their first sight of them. But Samarkand was more than beautiful. It was intellectual. Under rulers like Ulugh Beg in the 15th century, the city became a center of astronomical research. Its observatory produced star charts of unprecedented accuracy. Its libraries held works from across the known world, translated into multiple languages, accessible to scholars of every culture. The city's wealth came from its perfect position, far enough from any empire to maintain independence, close enough to all trade, routes to benefit from every caravan. The Sogdian merchants who made Samarkand their home became the middlemen of the Silk Road, speaking multiple languages, trusted by all, essential to the system's functioning. Near Samarkand stood Bukhara as a learning center, another city of legendary scholarship. Noble Bukhara, they called it. Its madrasas educated students from across the Islamic world. The great physician and philosopher Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, studied and taught in Bukhara. The city's libraries were famous, its scholars renowned for contributions to medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. Bukhara's old city was a maze of narrow streets and covered bazaars, where it was easy to lose oneself, to wander from one architectural marvel to another, from one sphere of human knowledge to another, as if the city's physical complexity mirrored the complexity of the wisdom it contained. Further west still, in what is now Turkmenistan, stood Merv, oasis of empires. Merv is largely forgotten now, its ruins lonely in the desert, but there was a time when Merv was one of the world's greatest cities. It served as capital for multiple empires, Persian, Arab, Turkish. Its walls enclosed a vast area. Its irrigation system was sophisticated. Its libraries were rich. The scholar Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, and whose work on algebra changed mathematics forever, likely worked in Merv. The city was a center of Islamic learning during the medieval period, producing scholars, poets, and scientists whose influence spread across continents. In northern Afghanistan, ancient Balk's religious importance made it a destination for pilgrims of multiple faiths. The Zoroastrians called it Mother of Cities. Buddhists revered it as a center of learning. Muslims knew it as the birthplace of Rumi, the greatest Sufi poet. Balkh was old, even when the Silk Road was young. Its layers of history piled deep like sediment, each era adding to the sacred character of the place. As routes moved further west, they reached Ctesiphon, the Persian capital, with its magnificent arch, the largest single-span vault in the world at the time, standing as testament to Sasanian engineering and ambition. Ctesiphon sat on the Tigris River, connecting overland routes to river trade, linking the Silk Road to Mesopotamian commerce. Persian kings received embassies here from China and Rome alike, playing the two great empires against each other, profiting from their rivalry. In the Syrian desert, Palmyra's caravan wealth made it one of the most dramatic cities of antiquity. Palmyra was an oasis city that taxed every caravan passing through, growing rich on its strategic position between the Roman and Persian worlds. Its ruins still astound. Colonnaded streets stretching across the desert, a temple to Bel that mixed Roman and Middle Eastern architecture, a theatre where performances once echoed across stone seats. Queen Zenobia briefly made Palmyra the capital of her own empire, challenging Rome itself before being defeated. But even in defeat, Palmyra's glory spoke to the power that could be built on Silk Road trade, the wealth that flowed through these desert corridors. And finally, at the western end, where the Silk Road met the Mediterranean and the sea routes beyond, Venice and Genoa rise in Europe. These Italian city-states became the European terminus of the Silk Road, the places where goods from Asia finally reached European markets. Venice, built impossibly on lagoons, sent its merchants eastward, establishing trading posts throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The Venetians became middlemen, buying spices and silk that had traveled thousands of miles and selling them throughout Europe at enormous profit. The wealth of Venice, its palaces, its art, its power, was built on Silk Road trade. Genoa, Venice's rival, played the same role, its merchants spreading across the known world. Marco Polo, the most famous Silk Road traveler in Western memory, was Venetian. His journey to China and back, his service in Kublai Khan's court, his descriptions of the East, these captured European imagination and inspired the age of exploration that would eventually make the Silk Road obsolete. So you see, the Silk Road was not a road, but a string of pearls, each city a luminous gem, each one vital, each one contributing something essential to the whole. From Chang'an to Venice, from Dunhuang to Genoa, these cities were humanity's dreams made stone and brick, gardens planted in deserts, civilization defying distance and difficulty. Rest now, and in your dreams, walk these ancient streets. Hear the languages mixing in the bazaar. Smell the spices and incense. See the architecture reaching toward heaven. These cities live on in us, in the connections they made, in the exchanges they facilitated, in the simple truth they embodied. That distance need not divide us, that walls can have gates, that strangers can become friends. Let the cities of dreams carry you gently to sleep. Now, let us turn from the cities themselves to the people who moved between them. For routes are nothing without travelers, and the Silk Road lives most vividly in the stories of those who walked it, rode it, sailed it. These were not abstract lines on a map, but journeys taken by real people, sometimes driven by profit, sometimes by faith, sometimes by simple curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. Close your eyes and imagine you are joining a caravan. Feel the sway of the camel beneath you, the endless rhythm of footsteps on ancient paths. Around you, fellow travelers speak languages you barely understand, but you share the same dust, the same dangers, the same wonder at the world's vastness. Let us meet some of these travelers, these bridge builders between worlds. First, we must speak of those who made the Silk Road their profession, their livelihood, their life. Sogdian merchants dominate trade for centuries, becoming the indispensable middlemen of the ancient world. The Sogdians came from the region around Samarkand and Bukhara, and they possessed a gift for languages, for cultural adaptation, for the complex negotiations that long-distance trade required. A Sogdian merchant might speak Chinese, Persian, Turkish, and Sanskrit with equal fluency. He would know the preferences of customers in Chang'an and Constantinople alike. He would understand which goods commanded premium prices in which markets, which seasons were safest for travel, which officials could be bribed, and which must be respected. Sogdian trading colonies existed from China to the Black Sea, creating networks that spanned continents. These merchants left their mark in unexpected places. In caves along the Silk Road, archaeologists have found Sogdian graffiti, merchants recording their passage, their prayers for safe journey, their business dealings. These casual inscriptions remind us that the Silk Road was not exotic to everyone. For Sogdians, it was simply work, the family business, the way life had always been. But the Sogdians were not alone in their mastery of long-distance trade. Jewish Radanite traders connect continents in the medieval period, creating their own extensive networks. The Radanites, the name may mean those who know the way, spoke Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, and the languages of the Franks and Slavs. They were perfectly positioned to bridge the Islamic and Christian worlds, moving freely through regions where others might face suspicion or restriction. The Radanites traded in luxury goods, spices, silks, furs, slaves, carrying them from the Mediterranean to India, from Francia to China. Like the Sogdians, they established communities along the route, creating chains of trust that made long-distance trade possible. In an age when a merchant might not see his goods again for years after shipping them, trust was the most valuable commodity of all. But not everyone who traveled the Silk Road sought profit. Many sought something far more precious: spiritual truth, sacred knowledge, connection with the divine. In the early 5th century, centuries before Xuanzang, another Chinese monk made a similar journey. Faxian's early pilgrimage took him from China to India in search of authentic Buddhist texts. He traveled overland through Central Asia, crossing deserts where, above, there are no birds, below, there are no beasts, as he wrote in his account. He nearly perished multiple times but persevered, driven by devotion. Faxian spent years in India, studying, collecting texts, visiting sacred sites. His return journey took him by sea, nearly ending in shipwreck. When he finally reached China after 14 years of travel, he brought back not just scriptures but detailed accounts of the lands he had visited, providing Chinese readers with their first reliable descriptions of India and Central Asia. And then, 2 centuries later, Xuanzang's return with scriptures built upon Faxian's legacy, but surpassed it in scale and impact. We have spoken of Xuanzang before, but let us linger a moment longer on his journey's end. When he approached Chang'an after 17 years abroad, the emperor himself ordered celebrations. Crowds lined the streets to witness the return of the monk who had ventured beyond the known world and returned to tell the tale. Xuanzang spent the rest of his life translating the scriptures he had brought back, over 1,300 texts in total. He established a translation bureau, training disciples, creating a standardized vocabulary for Buddhist concepts in Chinese. His translations shaped how Buddhism would be understood in East Asia for centuries to come. His travel accounts inspired not just religious devotion, but geographical curiosity, making distant lands seem real and reachable. Now, let us leap forward several centuries to meet perhaps the most famous Silk Road traveler in Western imagination. Marco Polo's famous journey began when he was 17, traveling with his father and uncle from Venice to China. A journey that would take 3.5 years and cover thousands of miles. Marco Polo served in the court of Kublai Khan for 17 years, acting as an emissary, traveling throughout China and beyond on imperial business. When he finally returned to Venice, he brought back tales that seemed incredible to European ears. Paper money, coal for fuel, porcelain, the vast extent of China's cities and population. Europeans had never imagined such things. His book, The Travels of Marco Polo, dictated while he was imprisoned during a war between Venice and Genoa, became a medieval bestseller. Some doubted his stories. They seemed too fantastical, too grand. But Marco Polo, even on his deathbed when urged to recant his exaggerations, supposedly replied, "I have not told half of what I saw." Whether every detail of his account is accurate matters less than its impact. Marco Polo made the East real to Europeans in a new way. He inspired explorers and merchants. He influenced mapmakers. He planted seeds that would eventually grow into the age of exploration. Columbus carried a copy of Marco Polo's book on his voyage, hoping to reach the lands Polo described by sailing west. While Marco Polo traveled from west to east, another great medieval traveler moved through the Islamic world and beyond. Ibn Battuta reaches China in the 14th century. Though China was merely one destination in a lifetime of travel, that makes Marco Polo's journey seem modest by comparison. Ibn Battuta, from Tangier in Morocco, traveled for nearly 30 years, covering perhaps 75,000 miles, an almost incomprehensible distance for the medieval world. He visited Mecca multiple times, traveled throughout the Middle East, crossed the Sahara, sailed to India, where he became a judge, visited the Maldives, and finally reached China via the maritime Silk Road. His descriptions of China are fascinating. He found the cities prosperous and well organized, but felt alienated by the foreign customs and food. Unlike Marco Polo, who served in the Mongol court, Ibn Battuta remained an outsider, observing with the eyes of a Muslim scholar used to Islamic culture. His accounts provide an important counterpoint to European narratives, showing how Chinese civilization appeared from an Islamic perspective. Here is a traveler few people know, yet his journey was perhaps the most remarkable of all. Rabban Bar Sauma travels west from Beijing in the 13th century, a reverse Marco Polo, an Asian traveling to Europe to visit the Pope and European kings. Bar Sauma was a Nestorian Christian monk born in or near Beijing. He set out to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, but became entangled in the geopolitics of the Mongol Empire. The Mongol rulers sent him as an ambassador to Europe, hoping to arrange an alliance with Christian kingdoms against their common Muslim enemies. Bar Sauma met with the Byzantine Emperor, with King Philip IV of France, with King Edward I of England, with the Pope in Rome. He celebrated Easter in Rome, debated theology with cardinals, witnessed European customs with astonishment, just as Europeans who visited China were astonished by what they found. His journey demonstrates that the Silk Road carried travelers in both directions, that curiosity and diplomacy knew no single orientation. Even before Bar Sauma, other Europeans had ventured east on diplomatic missions. Giovanni da Pian del Carpine meets Mongols in the mid-13th century, sent by Pope Innocent IV to understand the Mongol threat and possibly convert them to Christianity. Carpine was 65 years old when he set out, an age when most medieval people were already dead or settled into quiet retirement. He traveled from Lyon through Eastern Europe and into the Mongol heartland, witnessing the election of a new great Khan. His account is filled with practical observations: what Mongols ate, how they fought, how their society was organized. It lacks Marco Polo's romance, but provides invaluable historical detail. Carpine returned with letters from the Mongol court that survive to this day, preserved in Vatican archives. Physical evidence of this unlikely meeting between papal envoy and Mongol emperor. Now let us turn briefly to the seas, for not all great journeys were overland. In the early 15th century, the Chinese admiral Zheng He sails the maritime Silk Road, commanding enormous fleets that dwarfed anything Europe would produce for another century. Zheng He's treasure ships, some reportedly over 400 feet long, sailed to Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the coast of East Africa. These were not voyages of conquest, but of diplomacy and trade, displaying Chinese power and wealth, bringing back exotic goods and tributary embassies to the Chinese court. Zheng He's voyages represent China's most ambitious maritime period. His fleets included hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men. They brought back giraffes from Africa, animals the Chinese had never seen, which they identified with the mythical qilin, a sign of imperial virtue. But after Zheng He's death, China turned inward, abandoning these expensive expeditions, leaving the seas to others. All these travelers, from merchants to monks to diplomats, benefited from periods of political stability that made long-distance travel possible. And no ruler did more to facilitate Silk Road travel than Kublai Khan protects trade in the 13th century, creating a period of relative safety and prosperity across much of the route. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, ruled the Mongol Yuan dynasty in China. He understood that trade benefited his empire, so he maintained roads, established way stations, protected merchants from bandits. He issued passports, metal tablets that guaranteed safe passage through Mongol territory. He welcomed foreign merchants and diplomats, creating a cosmopolitan court where talents of all backgrounds could flourish. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road experienced perhaps its final golden age. Travel from Europe to China became easier than it had ever been, or would be again for centuries. This was the period when Marco Polo, Rabban Bar Soma, and many others made their famous journeys. It was a moment when the entire length of the Silk Road fell under essentially one imperial system, when a traveler could journey from the Mediterranean to the Pacific with a single passport. But this moment would not last. After Kublai Khan's death, the Mongol Empire fragmented. The Black Death would devastate populations along the routes. Islamic and Christian powers would compete for control, and eventually, Portuguese and Spanish ships would find sea routes to Asia, making the overland Silk Road increasingly irrelevant. But in the stories of these travelers, Sogdian merchants and Jewish traders, Buddhist pilgrims and Mongol ambassadors, Chinese admirals and Venetian merchants, we find the Silk Road's true meaning. It was never really about silk or spices or any commodity. It was about human restlessness, the urge to see what lies beyond, the courage to venture into the unknown, the hope that somewhere out there, across the desert or over the mountains, something wonderful might be waiting. Each traveler was a thread in a vast tapestry, weaving connections between peoples who might otherwise never have known each other existed. Each journey was an act of faith. Faith that the road would not peter out in wasteland, that the next city would welcome rather than reject, that the journey would be worth its cost in time and danger and distance from home. Rest now and dream of journeys. Dream of caravans under star-filled skies, of ships with sails billowing in monsoon winds, of footsteps on ancient paths worn smooth by countless travelers before you. You are part of their story now, connected across time to everyone who ever wondered what lay beyond the horizon and had the courage to find out. Let the travelers' tales carry you gently into sleep. breathe slowly now, and let us consider a paradox of history. Sometimes the greatest periods of peace and prosperity are built by those remembered for war and conquest. Sometimes those who came as destroyers become, in time, protectors. This is the story of a moment when violence gave way to order, when the Silk Road experienced its final, brilliant flowering before a darkness fell that would change the world forever. Close your eyes and drift back to the 13th century, to a time when one empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe, when a single authority held sway over most of the Silk Road's length. This was the age of the Mongols, and though they arrived with thunder and fury, they would create something unexpected, a great peace. Pax Mongolica stabilizes trade across the vast territories conquered by Genghis Khan and his descendants. Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, named in echo of the Pax Romana, that earlier era when one empire's order allowed commerce and culture to flourish. Just as Roman roads once connected the Mediterranean world, Mongol authority now connected east and west in ways never before achieved. Before the Mongols, a merchant traveling from Europe to China would need to negotiate with dozens of kingdoms, pay countless tolls, navigate a patchwork of languages and customs and currencies. Each border was a barrier, each new ruler a potential threat. A caravan might be safe in one kingdom and robbed in the next. There was no guarantee, no unity, no overarching protection. But under Mongol rule, something changed. The Khans understood that a living, trading merchant was more valuable than a dead one. They grasped that taxing commerce was more profitable than plundering it. And so they created systems, structures, mechanisms of control that transformed the Silk Road from a hazardous adventure into something approaching a reliable trade route. Consider the marvel they built. The Yam postal relay system stretched across the empire, a network of stations spaced a day's hard ride apart. At each Yam station, fresh horses waited. Messengers carrying urgent imperial communications could ride day and night, changing horses at each station, covering distances that would exhaust any single mount. Imagine the sophistication of this system. Each station had to maintain multiple horses in readiness. There had to be fodder and water, grooms and farriers, messengers who knew the routes in darkness and in storm. The Yam system allowed messages to travel from one end of the empire to the other at speeds that wouldn't be matched until the telegraph. An order from the Khan in Karakoram could reach commanders in Persia in a matter of weeks rather than months. But the Yam was more than a postal system. It was a statement of imperial reach, a demonstration that no place within the empire was too remote to be touched by the Khan's authority. It was infrastructure on a continental scale, the logistics of power made visible. And merchants, those essential tributaries of wealth flowing into imperial coffers, could sometimes use the Yam stations as well, paying for the privilege of fresh horses and safe shelter. The line between official communication and commercial transport blurred, all of it serving to knit the empire together, to make distance less of an obstacle, to turn weeks into days. And for those traveling on imperial business or with imperial blessing, there were the paisa, passports for merchants that guaranteed safe passage throughout Mongol domains. These were not mere documents, but physical tokens of authority, tablets made of gold, silver, or bronze, inscribed with commands that no local official could ignore. A merchant carrying a paisa was under the Khan's personal protection. To harm such a merchant was to insult the Khan himself. The Pacer commanded local authorities to provide horses, food, shelter, guards, whatever the bearer needed to continue their journey. It was a medieval credit card, a diplomatic immunity, and a guarantee of safety, all combined into one sacred object. The Pacer came in different levels, reflecting different ranks of authority. A golden Pacer might be carried by an ambassador or high-ranking official. Silver Pacers were for important merchants and lesser officials. Bronze for those of more modest status. But all carried weight, all opened doors, all transformed their bearers from vulnerable travelers into protected emissaries of imperial power. Marco Polo almost certainly carried a Pacer during his years in Kublai Khan's service. It explains how he could travel so widely through the empire, how he had access to imperial resources, how he moved with confidence through territories that would have been deadly to an unprotected foreigner. And so, for perhaps the first time in history, Europe and Asia connect directly in sustained, regular commerce. Not just the occasional traveler bringing back tales of wonder, but systematic trade, diplomatic exchanges, a flow of goods and ideas that seemed almost ordinary in its regularity. European merchants established themselves in Mongol territories. Asian goods reached European markets in unprecedented quantities and variety. The papal court sent multiple embassies to Mongol Khans, hoping to convert them, to forge alliances against common enemies, to understand these world-conquering newcomers. Letters passed between popes and Khans, between European kings and Mongol princes, creating a diplomatic correspondence that spanned continents. In this period, Chinese inventions like gunpowder and printing accelerated their westward journey. Persian and Arab learning flowed more freely into Europe. The exchange was never equal. Geography and politics still created imbalances, but it was more open, more sustained, more transformative than ever before. Christians and Muslims, Buddhists and shamanists, merchants and monks, diplomats and adventurers, all moved along routes that the Mongol peace had made safer, faster, more predictable. It was a golden age for the Silk Road, a moment when the dream of true connection between East and West seemed almost realized. But there was a shadow falling across this connected world, a shadow that would demonstrate, terribly, that not everything carried along the Silk Road was beneficial, that the same routes that carried silk and spices, ideas and innovations, could carry something else, something deadly. The Black Death spreads along routes in the mid-14th century, following the same paths that merchants and pilgrims had traveled for over 1,000 years. The plague, Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on rats that traveled with caravans and ships, moved from Central Asia westward and eastward, leaping from city to city, from trading post to port, carried by the very networks that the Silk Road had created. The disease reached the Mongol armies, besieging the trading city of Kaffa on the Black Sea. When their own soldiers began dying, the Mongols, whether in desperation or malice, catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. The plague spread through Kaffa, and from there, it boarded ships heading to Mediterranean ports. By 1347, it had reached Sicily. From there, it spread throughout Europe with devastating speed. Within 5 years, perhaps 1/3 of Europe's population perished. Cities lost half their inhabitants. Villages were abandoned. The social and economic order that had existed for centuries shattered. There weren't enough living to bury the dead. Entire professional classes, clergy, physicians, craftsmen were decimated. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the physical toll. How could people trust in divine protection when such horror visited the faithful and faithless alike? How could society continue when death struck so randomly, so quickly, so completely? The plague traveled eastward too, along the Silk Road, reaching China, where it contributed to the fall of the Mongol Yuan dynasty. Population decline was severe throughout Asia. The connected world that had seemed such a triumph became a corridor of contagion. And when the plague finally subsided, the world it left behind was changed. The Mongol Empire fragmented, different khanates pursuing different interests, sometimes warring among themselves. The unity that had protected trade dissolved. Routes that had been safe became dangerous again. The Pax Mongolica, that great peace, was over. It is worth contemplating, as you drift towards sleep, this double-edged nature of connection. The same ships that carried spices carried plague. The same caravanserais that sheltered merchants sheltered infected rats. The same networks that spread ideas spread disease. Connection is never neutral. It amplifies both the beneficial and the harmful, spreading what we want and what we fear in equal measure. The Silk Road made the Black Death possible, just as it made so many other exchanges possible. Without those established routes, without those chains of contact stretching across continents, the plague might have remained localized, tragic, but contained. Instead, it became pandemic, remaking the world. Yet even in this darkness, we can see the profound truth the Silk Road embodied. We are all connected. What happens in one place affects another, sometimes in ways we cannot foresee. The merchant in Kaffa did not imagine that his infected cargo would depopulate European cities. The Khan establishing the Yam system did not foresee it becoming a highway for plague. Good intentions and careful planning cannot always prevent unintended consequences. It is worth contemplating, as you drift towards sleep, this double-edged nature of connection. The same ships that carried spices carried plague. The same caravanserais that sheltered merchants sheltered infected rats. The same networks that spread ideas spread disease. Connection is never neutral. It amplifies both the beneficial and the harmful, spreading what we want and what we fear in equal measure. The Silk Road made the Black Death possible, just as it made so many other exchanges possible. Without those established routes, without those chains of contact stretching across continents, the plague might have remained localized, tragic but contained. Instead, it became pandemic, remaking the world. Yet even in this darkness, we can see the profound truth the Silk Road embodied. We are all connected. What happens in one place affects another, sometimes in ways we cannot foresee. The merchant in Kaffa did not imagine that his infected cargo would depopulate European cities. The Khan establishing the Yam system did not foresee it becoming a highway for plague. Good intentions and careful planning cannot always prevent unintended consequences. The Mongol peace achieved something remarkable, a connected world where goods and ideas could flow more freely than ever before. For a brief moment, humanity glimpsed what true global connection might look like. The Yam system, the Paisa passports, the protected trade routes, these were genuine achievements, visions of infrastructure and order that wouldn't be matched for centuries. But that same connection carried seeds of disaster. The Black Death was not the Silk Road's fault, yet the Silk Road enabled its spread. This is the paradox we still live with today. In our far more connected world, every connection is a potential conduit for harm as well as good. Every network is vulnerable. Every bridge can carry traffic in both directions. Rest now in the knowledge that even great disasters pass. The Black Death ended. Populations recovered. New kingdoms rose from the ashes of old empires. The Silk Road itself would decline, but humanity's urge to connect, to trade, to exchange, to reach across distances, that never died. It merely found new forms, new routes, new expressions. Let the lessons of peace and plague, of order and chaos, of connection and its consequences settle gently in your mind as you drift into sleep. Tomorrow awaits, but tonight, rest in the knowledge that humanity endures, adapts, continues, even through the darkest times. The great peace lives on in memory, and the roots it protected whisper still of what was and what might be. Now, as you settle deeper into rest, let us speak truthfully about what traveling the Silk Road really meant. We have talked of wonders, magnificent cities, precious goods, the meeting of civilizations, but beneath the romance lies a harder reality. The Silk Road was not a pleasure cruise through exotic lands. It was grueling, dangerous, uncertain. Those who traveled it were either very brave, very desperate, or very driven. Often, all three. Close your eyes and feel for just a moment what it might have been like. Not as a curious tourist with a return ticket home, but as a merchant in the 8th century, or a pilgrim in the 5th, staking everything on a journey that might never end, that might consume years of your life, that might cost you that life itself. Journeys could take years, not weeks, not months, but years. Imagine telling your family goodbye, knowing you might not see them again for 3, 4, 5 years. Knowing that children would grow in your absence, that parents might die before you returned, that the world you left behind would change in ways you couldn't predict or control. A merchant traveling from the Mediterranean to China and back might spend 3 to 4 years on the road. A pilgrim from China to India might be gone for a decade or more, like Xuanzang, like Faxian before him. These were not journeys to be undertaken lightly. They were commitments that consumed large portions of lives, that defined destinies, that tested the limits of human endurance and determination. During winter, routes might become impassable, forcing travelers to settle in for months, or waiting for spring thaws or summer heat to open the way forward. Illness could delay a caravan for weeks. Administrative difficulties, disputes over taxes, conflicts with local authorities, paperwork that moved at pre-modern speeds, could strand travelers in unfamiliar cities. Every delay compounded, turning planned seasons into actual years. And there was no way to communicate with home, no letters that could travel faster than you could travel yourself. Your family would know nothing of your fate, whether you were alive or dead, successful or ruined, delayed or approaching home. You were simply gone, swallowed by distance and time, existing in a space your loved ones could only imagine and worry over. The length of these journeys meant that goods traded in stages, passing through many hands before reaching their final destination. Very few merchants traveled the entire length of the Silk Road. Instead, each merchant would cover a section, perhaps 2 or 3 cities, maybe a particular region they knew well. They would buy goods in one place and sell them in another, and the next merchant would carry them onward. Picture a bolt of Chinese silk beginning its journey in Chang'an. A Chinese merchant might carry it to Dunhuang, where he sells it to a Sogdian trader. The Sogdian carries it to Samarkand, where it's purchased by a Persian. The Persian takes it to Baghdad, where an Arab merchant buys it. From Baghdad, it goes to Damascus with a Syrian trader. And finally, a Mediterranean merchant ships it to Rome or Constantinople. At each stage, the price increases. Each merchant must make a profit, must cover their costs, must account for the risks they've taken. By the time that bolt of silk reaches Rome, it might cost 20 or 30 times what it cost in Chang'an. This is why silk was worth its weight in gold in the Roman Empire. Not just because it was beautiful and rare, but because it had passed through so many hands, crossed so many borders, survived so many risks. This system meant that knowledge was fragmented too. A merchant in Rome might not know exactly where silk came from. The details grew vague through retellings. Chinese merchants might have only the haziest understanding of Rome. Each knew their section of the route, their trading partners, their local conditions. The full picture existed only in the aggregate, in the collective knowledge of all the traders combined. And danger was ever present. Bandits and raiders haunted the routes, preying on caravans, lying in wait at passes and narrow places where escape was difficult. The most successful bandits knew the routes as well as the merchants did, knew where travelers would be vulnerable, tired, off guard. Caravans traveled in groups for protection, sometimes hiring guards or soldiers to accompany them. But guards could be expensive, and they weren't always effective. Some bandit groups were large, well organized, essentially armies in their own right. In times of political instability, when empires weakened and authority fragmented, banditry could make entire sections of the Silk Road effectively impassable. Some raiders were opportunistic criminals. Others were nomadic peoples whose lands the routes crossed, who saw wealthy caravans as legitimate prey, as compensation for the environmental damage that heavy traffic brought, or simply as their due from those passing through their territory. The line between banditry and taxation could be thin. A protection fee paid to local powers might prevent violence, or it might simply be extortion that merchants had no choice but to accept. Travelers developed strategies. They tried to move quickly through dangerous areas. They concealed their most valuable goods. They traveled at night through some regions, during the day in others. They learned which passes could be trusted and which should be avoided. Knowledge of safe routes was itself valuable, closely guarded, sometimes deliberately obscured to protect competitive advantages. But bandits were not the only threat. The land itself could be merciless. Extreme climates tested travelers in ways that are hard for us, in our climate-controlled comfort, to fully appreciate. In the Taklamakan Desert, summer temperatures could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun was relentless. The sand reflected heat upward, and there was no shade, no respite. Travelers covered themselves completely, but the heat found ways through every layer of cloth. Water became the most precious commodity. A merchant might carry silk worth a fortune, but if his water ran out, he would trade it all for a single skin of water. Stories tell of caravans finding scattered goods in the desert. Silk, jade, precious metals, abandoned by travelers who chose survival over wealth, who literally could not carry anything more, who shed everything except what was essential for life. And in winter, some routes became deadly cold. mountain passes where summer travelers might need to strip to their shirts would, in winter, freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, could trap caravans in sudden storms, where blinding snow and temperatures far below freezing would kill those who couldn't find shelter quickly enough. The high altitude itself was dangerous. In the thin air of mountain passes, travelers would suffer headaches, nausea, shortness of breath. Some would develop altitude sickness that could be fatal if they couldn't descend quickly. Pack animals would struggle, sometimes collapsing, forcing the caravan to abandon goods or face being stranded. And then there was the desert we have mentioned before, the one that earned a name that still carries a chill. The Taklamakan, place of no return. Go in and you won't come out. This vast desert in what is now Western China was perhaps the single most dangerous obstacle on the Silk Road. The Taklamakan is one of the world's largest sandy deserts, an ocean of dunes that shifts constantly in the wind. There are no reliable landmarks. What was visible yesterday might be buried today. Sandstorms could rise with terrifying speed, reducing visibility to zero, disorienting even experienced guides, burying caravans that couldn't find shelter. The desert was also eerily quiet. Travelers reported hearing voices calling from the dunes, seeing mirages of cities that vanished as they approached. Whether these were hallucinations brought on by dehydration and heat exhaustion, or natural phenomena that sound and light can create in certain atmospheric conditions, they added psychological terror to physical danger. Many travelers believed the desert was haunted, populated by demons or the ghosts of those who had perished there. The Taklamakan swallowed caravans whole. Archaeological expeditions have found preserved bodies, mummified by the dry climate, still clutching the goods they tried to save. Ancient cities buried by sand, their walls and towers emerging briefly before being covered again. Evidence of human passage, human ambition, human failure, all preserved in that merciless environment. Yet people crossed it, not once, but repeatedly, for over 1,000 years. They crossed because on the other side was profit, or salvation, or home. They crossed because humans are stubborn creatures who refuse to accept that any place is truly unreachable. They crossed because oases as lifelines made it just barely possible. These oases, Dunhuang, Turpan, Kashgar, Khotan, and smaller settlements whose names have been lost, were miracles of survival. Underground water channels called karets brought snowmelt from distant mountains. Wells were dug deep into the earth. Palm trees provided shade and dates. Gardens grew vegetables. These were not luxurious places, but they were life. They were rest. They were the promise that the desert was not endless, that crossing was possible. At each oasis, caravans would recover. Animals would be rested and watered. Travelers would bathe, eat proper meals, sleep in actual buildings rather than tents. They would exchange information, which routes were safe, which were not, what conditions lay ahead. They would resupply, hiring new guides if needed, replacing animals that had died or become too weak to continue. The oases were also cultural melting pots, places where travelers from all directions would meet, where languages and customs mixed, where news from across the known world would be shared over tea or wine in caravanserais. They were simultaneously endpoints and beginnings, places of rest and launching points for the next leg of impossible journeys. So you see, the Silk Road's glory, all those wonderful goods, all those transformative ideas, all those connections between civilizations came at a cost measured in years, in danger, in extreme hardship. Every precious object that traveled those routes carried with it the suffering of those who transported it. Every idea that spread was carried by someone who endured heat and cold, thirst and altitude, bandits and storms. We honor them, these travelers, by remembering that what they accomplished was genuinely difficult, genuinely brave. The Silk Road was not inevitable. It existed because people were willing to pay its terrible price, to risk years of their lives, to venture into places of no return, and somehow, impossibly, return anyway. Rest now, grateful for the comfort of your bed, for the safety of your walls, for the certainty of tomorrow. Let the hardships of ancient travelers remind you of the resilience of the human spirit, the determination to connect despite every obstacle, the refusal to let distance or danger prevent us from reaching toward each other. Let the oases of your dreams be gentle and welcoming. Let the deserts of your sleep be crossed without suffering. Let the bandits of your worries trouble you no more tonight. Rest in peace, knowing that the journey is over for today. And so we come, at last, to the end of our journey. But endings are strange things, rarely clean, never complete. The Silk Road did not end with a single event, a gate closing, a final caravan disappearing over the horizon. Instead, it faded, gradually, like twilight giving way to night, like a path grown over with grass. Still there, beneath the surface, still traceable if you know where to look. Breathe slowly now, and let us walk together through this long twilight, this gradual transformation from living route to historical memory, and then, surprisingly, to renewed relevance in our modern world. The fall of the Mongol Empire in the 14th century removed the unifying authority that had made the Silk Road's golden age possible. The great empire fragmented into competing khanates, the Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Yuan Dynasty in China. These successor states sometimes cooperated, but often competed or fought outright wars. The Paiza passports lost their universal authority. The Yam stations fell into disrepair or were claimed by local powers. The protection that merchants had enjoyed vanished like morning mist. Then came the Black Death, which we have already discussed, devastating populations along the routes, disrupting trade, making the very idea of long-distance travel suddenly terrifying. Cities that had thrived on commerce lost half their populations. The survivors were understandably wary of strangers, of foreign goods, of anything that might carry the invisible contagion. And in the West, a new power rose that would reshape trade entirely. Ottoman control disrupts trade in ways both deliberate and incidental. The Ottoman Empire, emerging in the 14th century and reaching its height in the 16th, controlled the western termini of the Silk Road, the approaches to Constantinople, the routes through Anatolia, the pathways to the Mediterranean. The Ottomans were not opposed to trade, far from it, but they were Muslim, and Christian Europe was increasingly hostile to Islamic powers. The old cosmopolitan tolerance that had characterized Silk Road cities gave way to religious rivalry. Taxes increased. Access became restricted. European merchants found it increasingly difficult and expensive to obtain Asian goods through Ottoman-controlled routes. And so, Europe looked for alternatives. European sea routes bypass land paths, fundamentally changing global trade patterns. Portuguese ships in the late 15th century rounded the southern tip of Africa, finding a sea route to India that avoided Ottoman territory entirely. Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, and suddenly silk and spices could flow to Europe without traversing a single mile of the Silk Road. Spanish ships, sailing west in search of Asia, stumbled upon the Americas instead, a discovery that would ultimately prove even more transformative than finding a sea route to the east. European powers began building maritime empires, establishing colonies, creating trade networks that connected continents through ocean rather than overland routes. Ships could carry more cargo than camel caravans. Sea routes, when winds were favorable, could be faster than overland travel. The risks were different: storms, scurvy, pirates, but they were manageable, and the profits were enormous. Within a few decades, the economic center of gravity shifted from the Silk Road to the sea lanes. At the eastern end of the route, China made a fateful decision. Ming China turns inward after overthrowing the Mongol Han Dynasty in 1368. The Ming emperors, seeking to establish legitimacy and restore Chinese cultural traditions after a century of foreign rule, became increasingly suspicious of foreign influences and foreign trade. Zheng He's great maritime expeditions were discontinued. The treasure ships were left to rot or were broken up. Laws were passed restricting foreign trade. The cosmopolitan openness of Tang and Yuan China gave way to Ming insularity. China, which had once been the most outward-looking civilization on Earth, began closing its doors. This inward turn was not absolute. Trade continued, especially through maritime routes to Southeast Asia. But the Ming dynasty's enthusiasm for long-distance overland trade never matched that of earlier dynasties. The Chinese end of the Silk Road, once so vital and active, became quieter, less important to imperial policy, increasingly peripheral to China's economic life. But here is something important to understand as you drift towards sleep. Trade never fully disappears. Even as the Silk Road declined as a major commercial artery, some traffic continued. Merchants still traveled between Central Asian cities. Pilgrims still journeyed to sacred sites. Ideas still moved, albeit more slowly. The routes might no longer be the highways of world commerce, but they remained local and regional connectors, threads in a smaller web. Small caravans still crossed deserts. Oasis towns still welcomed travelers. The knowledge of the routes remained alive in the memories of those who lived along them, even as the wider world's attention shifted elsewhere. The Silk Road became more legend than reality, more past than present, but it never completely vanished. And then, in our own era, something remarkable happened. The world remembered. In 2014, UNESCO World Heritage designation recognized the Silk Roads as a collective cultural heritage of humanity. A network of sites across China, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan was inscribed on the World Heritage List, acknowledging the route's historical significance, committing nations to preserve what remains of this ancient network. Archaeological sites are protected. Ancient cities are excavated carefully rather than bulldozed for development. Museums display Silk Road artifacts. Scholars study the routes from every angle: economic, cultural, religious, artistic. The Silk Road has become a symbol, a way of thinking about cultural exchange, about how civilizations connect and influence each other. And most ambitiously of all, China's Belt and Road Initiative explicitly invokes the Silk Road's legacy. This massive infrastructure project announced in 2013, envisions building roads, railways, ports, and economic corridors connecting China to Europe, Africa, and beyond. It is controversial, complex, and still unfolding, but it represents a conscious attempt to revive the spirit of the Silk Road, to create networks of trade and connections spanning continents. Whether the Belt and Road Initiative will succeed, whether it truly embodies the Silk Road's legacy, or merely borrows its prestige, remains to be seen. But the fact that modern China looks back to the Silk Road for inspiration tells us something about the power of that historical memory, the appeal of that vision of global connection. And the Silk Road lives on in other ways too. Diaspora communities remain scattered along the old routes, descendants of merchants who settled far from their ancestral homes, communities that preserve languages and traditions carried along these paths centuries ago. In Uzbekistan, in Western China, in Iran, in Turkey, in communities scattered throughout Central Asia and beyond, people live whose ancestors were Silk Road travelers, whose cultures were shaped by that long history of exchange. These communities are living bridges to the past, maintaining traditions of hospitality to strangers, of multilingualism, of cultural flexibility that the Silk Road required. They are reminders that history is not just past. It lives in the present, in bloodlines and customs, in recipes and stories, in the way people greet each other and conduct business. And oh, the cultural treasures the Silk Road left behind. Greco-Buddhist art emerges from the meeting of Greek aesthetic traditions, brought east by Alexander's conquests, and Buddhist religious themes. In the Gandhara region, in what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, sculptors created Buddha statues with Greek faces, wearing Greek-style robes, their features reflecting Mediterranean ideals of beauty applied to Indian religious iconography. This fusion spread eastward along the Silk Road, influencing Buddhist art throughout Central Asia and China. The serene Buddha faces we associate with East Asian Buddhism owe something to Greek sculptural traditions that traveled those ancient routes. It is a perfect example of what the Silk Road made possible, not just the movement of objects, but the blending of entire artistic traditions into something new, something that belonged to no single culture, but synthesized many. And there are the wonderful stories of exchange and espionage, silk production secrets and smuggling. We have mentioned this before, but it bears repeating. China guarded the techniques of silk production fiercely. Revealing the secret was supposedly punishable by death, yet the secret escaped, probably multiple times through multiple routes. Legend says that a Chinese princess, marrying a Central Asian king, smuggled silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds in her elaborate headdress, hiding them in her hair where guards would not dare search. Whether this specific story is true or not, the secret did spread to Khotan, to Persia, eventually to the Byzantine Empire, where Justinian established imperial silk workshops in the 6th century. The spread of silk production demonstrates something important. Knowledge wants to be free. No secret, no matter how valuable, can be kept forever. The Silk Road, by connecting peoples, made the spread of knowledge inevitable. What belonged to one culture would eventually belong to all. Paper money astonishes travelers when Marco Polo and others first encountered it in China. The idea that marks on paper could have value, could be exchanged for real goods, seemed almost like magic to Europeans, used to coins of precious metal. Marco Polo devoted considerable space in his account to explaining this marvel to his readers, knowing they would find it hard to believe. The concept would eventually spread westward, though it took centuries for paper currency to become common in Europe. But the seed of the idea traveled the Silk Road, planted in the minds of merchants and travelers who saw it work in China and carried that knowledge home. And culinary exchanges. Noodles and bread, for instance. Did noodles travel from China to Italy, becoming pasta? Did bread techniques move from the West to the East? The truth is probably more complex. Many cultures independently developed similar foods, but the Silk Road certainly facilitated the exchange of recipes, cooking techniques, ingredients. The spices that give Italian food its character came from the East. The wheat that Chinese noodles are made from came originally from the West. Food, like everything else, traveled and transformed. Modern archaeology continues to reveal Silk Road secrets. The Tarim Basin mummies reveal early contact between East and West that predates the Silk Road's establishment. These remarkably preserved bodies, found in the deserts of Western China, date back over 3,000 years. And astonishingly, many of them have European features: red or blonde hair, light-colored eyes, clothing of wool plaid. These mummies tell us that contact between East and West is far older than we once thought, that the Silk Road formalized and expanded roots and connections that had existed in more limited forms for millennia. The human urge to travel, to trade, to explore beyond the horizon is ancient, perhaps as old as humanity itself. And what does it all mean? Perhaps we can say this: the Silk Road as early globalization, as humanity's first sustained attempt to connect across continents, to create networks that spanned the known world. It was imperfect, dangerous, often exploitative, but it was real, and it worked. For over 1,000 years, the Silk Road proved that connection was possible, that peoples separated by vast distances and profound cultural differences could find ways to exchange, to communicate, to influence each other. It created precedents for international trade, for cultural tolerance, for the idea that diversity could be beneficial rather than threatening. But perhaps ideas and diseases as its true legacy is the most important insight of all. The goods that traveled the Silk Road, the silk and spices, the jade and glass. These are museum pieces now, beautiful but inert. The cities have crumbled or transformed. The caravanserais are ruins or tourist sites. The physical Silk Road is mostly gone, but the ideas that traveled those routes live on. Buddhism in China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam. This is Silk Road legacy. Islamic influence in Central Asia and Western China. Silk Road legacy. Paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass. All Silk Road legacies. Mathematical concepts, astronomical knowledge, agricultural techniques, artistic styles, all carried along those routes, all still influencing us today. And yes, diseases too. The Black Death was a Silk Road legacy, as were countless smaller epidemics. The routes that connected us also made us vulnerable to each other. This is still true today, in our far more connected world. Every connection is a double-edged sword. So what is the Silk Road really? It is both more and less than we imagine. It was never a single road, but a network, a web, a set of possibilities. It was never just about silk, but about everything humans could create and desire. It was never just trade, but also pilgrimage, diplomacy, exploration, migration, conquest, and cultural exchange. The Silk Road was a conversation, perhaps humanity's longest conversation, conducted over centuries in dozens of languages through the exchange of objects and ideas, diseases and innovations, art and warfare. It was imperfect, often unjust, sometimes catastrophic, but ultimately transformative. It made the world we live in more connected, more aware of diversity, more accustomed to exchange. And it whispers still, in the ruins along its routes, in the art in our museums, in the ideas we inherit without knowing their origins. The Silk Road is both completely gone and forever present, both ended and continuing, both past and future. Rest now, knowing that you are part of this story too. We are all connected across time and space, all participants in exchanges we barely understand, all travelers on routes we did not choose, but can navigate with grace and curiosity and courage. Let the gentle hum of the Silk Road carry you into dreams of connection, of bridges built across impossible distances, of strangers becoming friends, of the magnificent, messy, dangerous, beautiful human project of reaching toward each other across every barrier. The Silk Road's journey is complete, but yours continues tomorrow. For now, sleep and dream of caravans moving through starlight, of cities awakening to possibilities, of hands passing precious things from one to another across the span of centuries. Rest well, traveler. Rest well. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoy this video. If you did, please subscribe and click the bell icon to receive notifications about new videos. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.